Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. Welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists and authors about the important work and the stories behind them. Joining me today is Vanessa S. Williamson. She is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, as well as a senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. Her work has appeared in outlets including the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Atlantic. And her new book, The Price of Democracy, The Revolutionary Power of Taxation in American History, is out now. Vanessa, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, I had read that kind of the impetus behind your book was back when you were doing work on your first book and you were covering the Tea Party and that movement back in Obama's first term, and you kind of got the bug put into your mind when you were interviewing a woman, a Gold Star mom, who had lost her son in Iraq, and you were actually interviewing her about that, but the conversation turned into one of taxation. Can you talk with us about how that kind of grew into your book and your understanding of how people view taxation here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so when I was interviewing Tea Party activists who were these, conservative activists in the early days of the Obama administration, I was struck by how often they described themselves as taxpayers. It was a funny thing because at the end of the day, it's mandatory to pay taxes. So it's not really, something that you opted into, or it doesn't make you unusual. And so it struck me that this was such a powerful sort of identity for people. And what I came to realize is that your feeling of being a taxpayer is a way of saying that you belong in a country, that this country is your country. It's something that you've contributed to. And it's also a way sometimes of saying that perhaps some other people don't belong. And so that was really insight in the first book about sort of how people think about taxes today. But what I realized is that story about we the people and who is we the people is wrapped up in taxation from the very beginnings of this country.
Well, obviously, we had the phrase "no taxation without representation," and that was a driving force in the American Revolution and in the fight for our country. But I find it interesting that you have talked about how this is such a driving force on the right and has, their very conservative views on taxation, how that has helped dovetail into a movement that has not necessarily embraced democracy either.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let me tell you a story. It's because I think sometimes people misunderstand the origins of taxation and representation in the United States. Of course, you've heard about the original Boston Tea Party, right? And back in 1773, when Boston mechanics and artisans threw tea into Boston Harbor. I think most people, if they were asked what that was about, they would say it was because people were angry about high taxes. Mm-hmm. But actually, the opposite is true. They were angry about a tax cut. There was a special corporate tax cut for the East India Company, which was a corporation that had been deemed too big to fail. It was being given a huge bailout, right? And
this all sounds very familiar, by the way.
Right? Yeah, doesn't it ring a few bells these days? So the artisans and people of Boston were really angry about this. Sam Adams described this special deal for one corporation as introductive of monopolies. And that's why they threw the tea in the harbor. So people were angry about taxes, but not always in the way you might think. First of all, they were mad about special tax breaks for corporations. And secondly, they weren't mad about paying taxes. They just wanted to be represented in the government that the money went to. So several of the states, when Britain first tries to tax the American colonies, several of the state legislatures, or then the colonial legislatures, wrote to say, just tell us how much money you need, and we'll raise it here because we know how to do that in a way that fits our local economy, and it won't, cause problems for farmers and all these things, because Parliament was really far away and they didn't actually know how to tax people in a way that worked well, right? So what people wanted was taxation with representation, and they saw that as a kind of liberty. And that's really a story that's been lost in this new sort of conservative rhetoric around taxation, this new conservative adoption of the sort of Tea Party symbolism, which makes it seem like this country has been anti-tax from the beginning, but that's certainly not true. Mm-hmm. Taxation is wrapped up in the development of representation, and it's necessary for a democracy. Free countries are high tax countries, right? You think about globally, that's certainly true. Because when you tax people, they start asking for the government to do things, and they want representation, they want to participate. And then they have the money to do the things that people want, right? If you have a democracy but no money to spend, what are those elected officials going to do?
Mm-hmm.
So the anti-tax rhetoric in America doesn't come from our colonial, independence seekers, right? It actually comes from a far nastier tradition. It comes from American slave owners who were very concerned that a democratic country, even one where only white propertied men could vote, they were worried that people would achieve abolition by raising taxes on slaves. And so they opposed taxation from the beginning. And throughout our history, whenever we've had a movement that was opposed to democracy, like the slave owners were, like Jim Crow governments were, they always try and undermine the tax system. And you're seeing that again today.
Yeah, could you go into that more about how slaveholders and then following with reactionaries in the Reconstruction era and then later industrial elites have really effectively used tax policies to preserve their power?
Right. So if you can imagine, a democracy isn't just voting, right? The government it's about people having the power to do things through their government. So if you're on the one hand trying to prevent elections from being meaningful, right? You're trying to keep people from voting, you're trying to limit suffrage, you're trying to make it hard to vote, you're trying to gerrymander, whatever it is. On the one hand, you're trying to keep people from voting. At the same time, the second strategy that is always used by anti-democratic forces in the United States is to ensure that the government doesn't have any money. So even if they lose an election, the government's too poor to endanger private forms of power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what you see slaveholders put in place. All the tax restrictions in our Constitution come from the demands of slaveholders, right, to protect slavery against taxation. And they did that in their own states as well. It wasn't just about the federal governments and the federal government's powers. You see the same thing in Jim Crow. In the Jim Crow governments, they put in place these huge supermajority requirements to raise taxes, not to lower them, but only to raise, right, one-sided, so that it's always the case that even if somehow the people you're trying to keep from voting somehow manage to vote anyway, they'll be given a government that's too weak to act. And so it's a dual strategy, a dual anti-democratic strategy. And you see that today. And so when you think about the rhetoric we've heard, it's one thing to want to, argue about the specifics of any particular tax plan, how much money do we need for X, Y, and Z? What are our priorities? That's all normal. And you can be annoyed by any given tax, of course, right? Many people are annoyed by the process of paying taxes. But when you get to the point of having a party that says taxes are always bad, that is a real warning sign for anti-democratic politics, because what it really means is that we will never trust the government to act, because we will never trust the people who that government is supposed to represent.
Right. And what we've seen is that you can never cut taxes enough. The levels that we had back in the 1980s, are now considered to be really onerous. We just saw a giant tax cut passed by Congress that will, very explicitly help people at the top. And we've seen this pattern over and over again with Republican administrations in Washington, where they do cut taxes quite a bit. And the historic pattern, for the last several decades has been that the economy does better under Democratic presidents than Republicans. And then the next Democratic president has to go and clean up the mess that was created with all of these tax cuts and what it's done to the economy. And so, to your point, it's difficult for government to actually act in a proactive way when they have less money and less wherewithal because of a weakened economy. And it seems that your argument is this is very much by design.
That is exactly right. Yeah. So when Republicans adopted a strategy of not caring about deficits, right, which had been coming slowly and steadily over the years, it really freed them to put Democrats in a bind, right, because they would just blow up the budget and then Democrats would try and be responsible about it, which meant they couldn't achieve their spending priorities, right? And this is what you saw this year is a good example, actually, right? So programs like Medicaid are popular programs. People like these. And so if you for years and years, they've been unable to, people who wanted to cut those programs have been unable to achieve their goals. So they're doing it in this backwards way where they cut the revenue, making it harder and harder to make those priorities affordable, right? And this year, I think it's really significant that they actually went ahead and made cuts to these very popular programs. And to me, it really indicates a lack of concern about popularity. And that's actually not what you want as a rule for elected officials. You don't want them thinking, it doesn't matter whether people like what I do, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you want is them to worry about whether the voters are going to, are pleased with their actions. That's what a democracy is supposed to be about. So this is, I think, another indication of that real rupture between the people, the majority, right, and what elected officials are doing this year.
Could you talk with us about more of where we've been in the last few decades, where it seems like there has been just a proliferation of right-wing think tanks and places for the ultra wealthy to put their money to advocate for such policies. And there's a real machinery there that supports these, far right economic policies, and seems to have pushed the Republican Party further and further in that direction.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, there's a long story that you can tell here that goes back to the New Deal, right? The people who opposed the New Deal programs, things like Social Security, were really angry and were really aware that they didn't have the most people on their side. Most people loved FDR, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this very funny story. They tried to get people angry about Social Security, and so all these businessmen put little pieces of propaganda in people's pay slips in factories across the country before FDR's reelection. And they said, you are sentenced to a new tax, which was to pay for Social Security, that'll come out of your paycheck every week. And the only way you can stop it is to vote against FDR. And so there's this wonderful thing that one of FDR's supporters said. He's just like, yeah, why wasn't there any propaganda in your pay stub before FDR got elected? It's because there weren't any pay stubs, because you were out of work. Right. Mm-hmm. And so people voted. It didn't work. Right. There was an effort to create popular mobilization against the kind of things that, that FDR was doing, and it didn't succeed. And so what you see is far right businessmen moving to build a whole intellectual infrastructure to try and turn that around. And in many ways, it hasn't actually succeeded. People are still, payroll taxes that pay for Social Security remain the most popular federal tax. People like sales taxes that they know that they pay. People aren't opposed to paying taxes themselves, and they still want to tax the rich. That has been a consistent thing since as long as there has been polling, right? The number one concern people have about taxation is that the wealthy and corporations aren't paying their share. So on one level, this campaign has not worked, but it has worked at the top. It has changed the rhetoric in Washington in a way that's really extraordinary. Where you go from something like LBJ saying, hey, we're going to raise your taxes, and what you're going to get is something called Medicare. And people were willing to do it. They were like, oh, that does sound excellent. We should definitely have health insurance, right? Mm-hmm. To Democrats never, ever talking, ever, about raising taxes on anyone. Occasionally, they'll say a little bit at the very, very tip top, but don't worry, not too much. It's a huge shift in the rhetoric, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what this conservative infrastructure built, was the language and the talking points and the media infrastructure to put those ideas out there in a way that really shifted, if not most people's actual views, the way that taxes are talked about in this country.
It seems like one of the ways that this movement has been most effective has been working at the state level, because state governments have to have balanced budgets. And so, they can't run into a deficit. And so if you have these laws, and I'm in Michigan, I've seen an effort to do this, and with the 2/3 majority to raise any taxes. Mm-hmm. Now there's an effort to get rid of property taxes. There's always something that they're trying to put on the ballot, because even with a Republican legislature, if you have one, it's still very difficult to get really extreme things passed. And I know they've had great success in other states as well, with these measures that make it just very difficult to raise taxes in any way. I take it that this has been a strategy as well. And it has been it seems to me to have been very effective.
Yeah. So all of these anti-tax measures that started in the 70s should be understood as part of a long reaction to the civil rights movement, right? When Black people, demanded and got their political rights back in this country, within probably hours, frankly, but within years, you see the reaction on the right, that the government is now no longer trustworthy, that we can't trust these people who are getting benefits, they don't deserve them. And I'll tell you one thing, this rhetoric is exactly the same stuff you heard in the reaction to Reconstruction, right? Our first effort at multiracial democracy in the years after the Civil War, when Black men were allowed to vote across the southern states. you see incredibly similar rhetoric. You see people talking about how, they're forming taxpayer conventions and talking about government waste and all this stuff that sounds completely contemporary. That's where you see the development of these ideas that the government, when it includes everybody, right, when Black Americans are included in the people, suddenly that government doesn't have the sort of anti-government rhetoric has a lot more effectiveness with white Americans, right? And so that so you see that exact dynamic play out after our second Reconstruction, after the Civil Rights Movement. And so what happens is in that first Reconstruction, right, where they overthrow Reconstruction in the southern states through violence, they put in place tax limitations. The first supermajority requirements go into place across the South as part of the effort to ensure that even if the white supremacist governments lost power to, even if somehow working class whites and Black people were able to vote again, they wouldn't actually be able to build the kind of governments they were trying to build. They wouldn't be able to build public school systems, for example. So that same thing happens again in the years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And so you see measures like in Mississippi, right? They have a supermajority requirement on their books and their constitution that's been there since the Jim Crow era, and it continues to undermine their capacity to raise money. There are schools in Mississippi that don't have heating because when less than 60%, but more than 50% of local voters said, yeah, we need to raise some taxes, that's not enough. Right. And so those measures start spreading all across the country after the Civil Rights Movement. And so you see it in California, you see it in Massachusetts, you see it in Colorado, all these limitations that mean that even when most people want to do things like fund the schools, they can't get it done because there are these super high bars to getting things across the finish line, right? And it's really significant that it happens in the states because, at a federal level, you keep cutting taxes, you blow up the deficit, but people don't see that, right? And so the impacts aren't there, and so people don't really get in trouble for what they're doing, right? But at a state level, you try and do these huge tax cuts like Kansas tried, and they ended up with a 4-day-a-week school week,
right?
And that the voters noticed that one, right?
Yeah,
and so
they eventually ended up with the Democratic governor, which seemed that would be unheard of.
Completely surprising, right? And so putting in place these supermajority requirements is a way of making legislators not have to take any responsibility. They get to cut the taxes, they get to make it impossible to raise taxes without being held to account because it's in the constitution of the state now. It's not my fault that we couldn't get to that 66% mark. So yeah, it's a concerted campaign to ensure that the government can't do what people want.
And then that kind of, dovetails with the other with other goals that, these conservative activists have, because if you don't have enough money to fund the government and make it effective, then it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that government doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that's a core message there as well that seems to drive a lot of policy today on the right.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the real asymmetries of contemporary politics is that if you want to demonstrate that government doesn't work, it's quite easy to do if you're in a position to prevent it from working, right? And that is a one-sided tool. That does not work on the other side. On the other side, you have to do the really hard work of construction, right? You can't just go around setting fires and breaking things. And so it makes life really hard for people who want government to work. And there's a huge ideological spectrum where that's true, right? The Republican Party has really been captured by an extreme position now. But even if you want a very centrist government, but a functional government, all the roadblocks are in place to make that incredibly difficult to achieve.
Yes. And we have a great example with DOGE in the federal government. I mean, the explicit purpose is deconstruction and blowing things up, and we've seen that government is not working more effectively, and frankly it doesn't seem like that was ever really the goal.
No, I mean there's no reasonable way in which you could describe DOGE as attempting to achieve government efficiency. They came in to break things, right? And it's sort of, to my mind, it's the analogy is sort of a child walking into a nuclear power plant and being, what does this button do? Push. What does this button do? Push. And then you find out those buttons actually did something pretty important. And sometimes they were literally about the nuclear stockpile. We fired all the people who were monitoring those things, and we had to bring them back, right? So in a way, the year has been very educational, I think, for Americans about all the things government does that they actually need. But this was not the way to find it out. Right? This was, a really concerted campaign of government destruction. And again, a notably anti-democratic campaign, right? There was no authority that gave Elon Musk the power to walk into government buildings and decide to turn off programs and fire people? Just being rich? That is the opposite of democracy, right?
Right.
And so I think that all of the things we've seen this year, right, are very much, I mean, I think they happened a lot faster than I anticipated, but it's very much where I thought I finished writing this book in November 2024. And, we've seen it happen faster than I'd have thought, but this is very much in the history that we've experienced, right? That when you don't want democracy to work, you go after the tax system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's, a lesson for everyone, right? That if you want democracy to work, you have to rebuild the tax system. People are probably not thinking about that when they're thinking about all the work we're going to have to do to reconstruct this country. But top of my list, and I know I'm biased, but right up there, I mean, you've got to get that IRS working again.
Right.
These efforts to politicize the IRS, that is absolutely what despots do, right? Stop collecting money fairly and start using, basically extortion, private forms of money to pay for stuff. That is real emperor, oligarch, despot stuff. So yeah, I mean, I hope that we'll be in a place, sometime soon to think about that rebuilding. And when we think about it, we've got to think about where the money's going to come from.
Yeah. Well, it seems that it's a question of who do you want government to work for? And the answer in the Trump administration seems to be the very wealthy, the people who personally have donated money to the president, and, which is kind of textbook oligarchy.
Yeah.
And that really does seem to go back to something, that you were saying earlier about this idea of putting an emphasis on I'm a taxpayer, and the idea of, who government is supposed to be for and who it isn't, and who is really a citizen and who isn't. And, I think sometimes we tend to think of fiscal policy as being very separate from civil rights or social issues. And frankly, that kind of compartmentalization probably has helped the Republican Party with some people who have just said, well, I want my taxes lower, so I'll take all the other stuff. But in reality, it's a really taxation. You make a powerful case how it is a tool for inequality in terms of what you get out of your government and what your basic rights are.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize all three ways that taxation is democratic. One, obviously, once upon a time, we had high top marginal tax rates in this country, and it prevented the consolidation of wealth. We rolled back those top tax rates. People got a lot richer. And that's how you end up with people with just too much money for our elections to be run fairly, right? When someone owns the major media sources and when you can give candidates $1 billion, that's not fair elections anymore, right? So yeah, taxes play this important role in preventing that kind of consolidation of wealth. They also provide, through both progressive taxation and regular old, things like Social Security taxes, the money to pay for stuff that makes the economy fairer, right? So that people are more free with Social Security, right? Old people are free from the fear that they're going to run out of money. They're free from being, worrying about being dependent on their children, and they act as citizens more. It's because of Social Security. It wasn't true before that old people vote at such high rates. They have the incentive and the resources to participate, right? But the third thing taxes do, we almost never talk about. Taxes actually build the parts of this country that are in public. Right? They build our sidewalks, they produce our court system, our public schools, all of these places where we're supposed to be equal, right? It's like the only places in our society that actually try, at least, to ensure that people are treated fairly, like that you can't slip a 20 across the desk at the DMV and expect like a better or faster driver's license. They'll look at you like you're crazy, right? That's because we have places where we say, no, you wait in the line, you're next. You'll get your things the same as everyone else does, right? And it doesn't work perfectly in our criminal justice system or in our public education system, but taxes are the thing that produces spaces of equality. And the damage we've done to those infrastructures is really serious. So when we think about what it will take to produce the kind of equality that makes democracy work again, we have to remember all the ways that taxes support that endeavor.
You were talking about the hope of how we can crawl back from this point in history and get to a place where we could reimagine, what our taxation system would be. And, even bigger than that, what kind of country we want to be
Yeah.
if we want to get back to a true democracy.
Yep.
How do you see that happening?
Yeah. Look, I wrote a book about our history because I think there's some real heroes that we've lost. Not, I mean, for example, right, the mechanics in Boston who said, no, actually, you don't get to pick one company that's going to get all, this special break. No, we don't do it that way, right? But, Tom Paine, the guy who wrote Common Sense, right? He said not just that America should be an independent country, but that we shouldn't have a king, right? He also wrote a tax plan that he thought would help prevent corruption at elections.
Mm.
And it was a progressive tax plan. He laid out all the brackets, and the top bracket was 100%, right? So we need to think really big about what this country can be in terms of rethinking of things like our tax system. During Reconstruction, I'm going to tell you about a guy you probably never heard of called Matthew Gaines. He's a Texas state senator. He had been enslaved all his life until emancipation, and he had been a field hand. And so he had taught himself to read in a cornfield by candlelight because it would have been illegal for him to do so. And only a few years after emancipation, he was a state senator in Texas. And there's this speech he gives. He stands on the front steps of the courtyard in his tiny little rural county in Texas. And he's talking to his constituents, who are almost all freed people who are still very poor. It's only a few years after slavery. And he's telling them about the new tax law. And he said, we're trying to raise taxes on land because the federal government didn't do land reform, right? They didn't give freed people plots of land the way that Lincoln wanted to do. So we're trying to raise taxes on land so maybe people can buy land. I've managed to buy a little land. I'm a taxpayer now, and I'm so proud. It's my privilege, right? I'm proud to fund the greatest government Texas has ever had, which was true. And then he talks also about the tax for schools, which was going to fall on everybody. It was a $1 tax, and that was a lot of money for freed people. And so he passes out copies of the tax plan. He says, this is what we're going to do with the money. We're going to build schools. We're going to build railroads that we can move west and throw our doors wide open, he says, right? Because they're still afraid, because there are these vigilantes roaming Texas and stealing from Black communities. And we're going to throw our doors wide open. And we're going to have public schools, and we're going to go to school together, Black and white kids together. And we're going to have this fairer society. We're going to build this beautiful future, right? And they didn't get it done. Right. Within a few years, the Reconstruction governments across the South had been overthrown by white supremacist violence, the violence that Matthew Gaines was trying to build a police force to protect against. But those heroes are our heroes. That's our history. And I think if we know more about them, we can be prepared to take the baton forward, right? Because we're going to have to do another Reconstruction, right? We're going to have to learn from the really big thinkers, from the revolutionaries who thought about things like, how do we have taxes so that our elections are fair? Who thought about, how can I tell regular people who are struggling that actually it's worth it to pay your taxes so that we can have these schools, And I think that those stories are the thing that can give us the hope to build what we need to build. Because I think we have a lot of great ideas about how to rebuild this country. We've had ideas on the shelf for years. We just haven't done them. And I think sometimes it's because we don't believe we can. But I believe we can. And so to me, learning from our history is just remembering that we're part of a tradition that's been trying for a long time to achieve our democracy. And I think now is the time.
So we have, as far as public opinion goes, you point out how taxing the rich is an incredibly popular idea, and it has been since polling existed. At the same time, I would say that the right has been very successful with this idea of pushing that a lot of programs benefit people that you don't want, whether it's people of color or immigrants. And that is becoming increasingly explicit in this administration, where there's not even coded language anymore.
Yeah.
And so and that seems to be enough so that there's not a mass movement out there of people who are like, hey, enough is enough. Elon Musk doesn't need another yacht. We need a fairer system so that my kids can have a school with heat in it, And so how do you overcome that? Because, now it's taken on, it's part of your identity. I'm a taxpayer, and, I play by the rules other people don't. And, it's kind of baked into our American ethos, this mythology. And that makes it very, very difficult to overcome.
Yeah. I mean, racism has been the most effective handmaiden of oligarchy in this country from the beginning, right? And that it is the great challenge. I think it is fair to say that it's not an intractable problem, but it is one problem. We are not going to be able to address poverty in America if we don't address the racism that is used to justify the unfairnesses of our system. Right. But I think you can talk to people about this. LBJ said this thing famously, right? That the lowest white man, you give him to someone to look down on, and you can pick his pocket. Hell, he'll open his wallet for you, right?
Right.
And the thing that I'm hoping people become more aware of is that when you hear this stuff about, oh, tax paying this and tax paying that, we're the taxpayers. They're not. You put your hand on your wallet, right? That's what you should do because someone's trying to pick your pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And so helping people to recognize a scam when they see it is really helpful, because it's the dog whistle, you should know what it means now. You should know it means they're coming for your schools, for your roads, right? And they're, they're coming to take, your tax dollars and ensure that they support, the three corporations who the oligarchs like. And so recognizing that racist language, right, and that anti-immigrant language is simply a precursor to your pocket getting picked, is probably the most important lesson Americans can learn. But the other thing to remember is public opinion says that most people want taxes to be higher on the rich. So the problem isn't just a persuasion campaign. Most people think that should be true. The problem is an organizing campaign, right? And that's an institutional problem. All of this money has been put in place on the right for literally decades, all through the years where tax rates were 90%. It can't have felt great if you were the rich guy trying to invest in these extreme free market views, and you're watching the 40s, 50s, and 60s happen. You're losing for decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they put the money in and they built an infrastructure. And that infrastructure turned what were in fact extreme minority views into a powerful public force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because democracy is not a public opinion poll. It is organized interests acting through the party system. So rather than worry about changing every heart and mind, right? We can do some of that, but we have enough hearts and minds, actually, if you just look at the numbers. The question is about getting people mobilized to participate, right?
Mm-hmm.
To turn their opinions into actions in a way that makes legislators pay attention. And I think that's where the energy needs to be focused, right? Is on building the institutions that allow people to act on the beliefs that they generally already hold.
Mm-hmm. And I would think that job one would be trying to get money out of politics as much as possible, because you see that people have, billionaires have much more sway than they ever have. They're funding our elections at just a breakneck speed since Citizens United, the court case in 2010. And that's very difficult for movements to compete with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's a ton of money on one side, right? But I think even as much of a problem as the money is the decline of people's experience of participation, right? Because the kind of way that you work with people in a job setting is actually not how you work with people in a voluntary setting. And I think we've lost a lot of our civic fabric in a way that people don't have experience organizing anything. They know, like the local PTO or at their church, they haven't done a ton of the kind of work it takes to hold regular meetings and to show up and to find out, when is that local Democratic Party meeting? Oh, I could bring 10 people and we could probably change the whole, it's probably more than half the people who come. So it's about going to, and this is what Tea Party activists were very good at. They went to local Republican meetings and they voted out the moderates who were there, and they put themselves in, and it made a real difference, right? They showed up to the town halls. And so...
And they started, they really targeted things at the local level too, which frankly, it's a lot of the left doesn't do as much.
Yeah, I mean, I think Indivisible has really done amazing work on this front, right? In terms of building those local connections. And, a lot of legislators don't hold town halls anymore because they know what would come. Right. But that kind of work, the day-to-day of it is not, dramatic. And it's not, maybe romantic in the way we say, and it's not maybe as sort of emotionally fulfilling as writing an angry screed on social media, but it is actually the stuff that needs to get done, right? And so I think, to me, as much as I worry about the money, I worry about whether people remember how to do that, or are willing to take the time, or can take the time to do that kind of thing. Because I mean, we've seen any number of politicians with, Bloomberg ran for president, right? I mean, that fizzled very quickly, because money is not actually the same as people supporting you. And
Right.
so I think that, to me, that's where the energy needs to be. And if I had $1 billion, that's why I would put it into things like supporting independent media. I would put it into supporting local organizations, because
Yeah.
it's the infrastructure that's missing. It's not that the people have changed their views very much. Frankly, they haven't.
Mm-mm. That's really interesting, the points that you're making about, you really need to be building these connections. And I can't help but think about how billionaires are in charge of social media and tech and AI, and so much keeps us isolated and
Yeah.
in our own silos, and how beneficial that is to the end goal of having the very wealthy pay nothing in taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been I think a lot about how many of our recent technologies isolate us, right? I mean, to some extent they connect us, but they also leave us alone in our rooms. We're not actually there with another person. And we say things online we would never say to someone's face, at least most of us, right? And so that just experience of genuinely interacting with other people and having to come to a decision, right? And maybe it's just about whether, another road gets speed bumps on it, right? These can be very contested conversations if you've ever been to local meetings, right? But that experience is the experience of democracy. This is what Tocqueville said, right? He talked about, why was America not immediately falling into despotism, which he, as a minor aristocrat, assumed that any democracy would, right? And it was because of the voluntarism. He said that it served the role in his mind that an aristocracy would stand between a despot and the people. These organizations, and he thought it was hilarious that people would get together in groups to engage in and to not drink alcohol. Right? He's like, it's so crazy. You could just sit at home and have a glass of water, but they all get together to talk about prohibition or whatever. And so that capacity of people to just actually be together, and to not, and you're in a room with someone, you don't have to worry about AI, do you? Right? You're free to actually connect with them and know who they are and to know them as a whole person. And so I think that's, if there's a mechanism that can counter the sort of the ugliness of a lot of the stuff that's online and a lot of the technologies that keep us apart, it's like genuinely local, genuinely face-to-face work.
Well, Vanessa, I really appreciate you taking so much time to talk with us. Your book is fascinating, and not only is it enlightening as far as looking at our history in a different way, but as you've made the point, there are so many lessons for us today. So the book is The Price of Democracy. I think we still have the cover. Good. And that's out now. And Vanessa, thank you again.
Thank you. This was so much fun.